Welcome to a 360 View, where today we get to talk to one of my good friends, Mark Mitford, with HR Catalyst. And Mark is a HR consultant, works with a lot of companies in Dallas, Fort Worth, does fantastic business. And I wanted to just take the opportunity and talk to you about some of the things that are going on in the world today and how that's affecting companies. But hey, tell us about HR Catalyst.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me today,
You
too.
bet.
Yeah, HR Catalyst. So, HR Catalyst Consulting, I started the company about 7 years ago. And the purpose of it is we really help smaller to middle market size companies, anywhere between typically 5 million to about 75 million in revenue, create and implement a people strategy in their business. So we find that a lot of companies who are that size, they really don't have a senior level HR person on staff, either like a director or a VP of HR. So we actually come in there as an outsourced VP of HR to help them create thought leadership around their people and being able to optimize their people's performance.
And I happen to know, having worked with, mutual clients, 360 Consulting and HR Catalyst, that you do great work, and that really serves a pretty big need in the market for those size companies. So,
Thank you.
I guess the question on everyone's mind is, you know, now that we've gone, we're in the middle of the COVID thing, and it's on the news and in everybody's mind. We were wearing masks before we came in, and how has this affected companies that you're working with? What's been the dynamic involved from COVID and people having to change their businesses, work remotely, all of those things?
Right now, that's a great question. I'll try to give you a fairly concise and succinct answer here. The first thing is, of course, because there are companies I actually work with a number of construction companies, and they have been very much, they've been classified as essential businesses. So it's been very much business as usual for them. The biggest thing, of course, that they've had to go through, just like you mentioned with masks, putting on masks today, is that they've got to really focus on safety. And the key thing is, even though they're outdoors, they're working in very close proximity to one another. So the biggest thing they really have to focus on is all the things that we're hearing about on the news, the hand washing, the social distancing, the wearing masks. And that's hard right now because we're starting to get in the middle of summer. So that's one of the biggest things that a lot of their folks had to be trained on very, very heavily. And also their managers, their foremen and superintendents, really harping on safety and making sure not only safety from a OSHA perspective, but also just from a pure safety perspective. That's one of the biggest things. The other big thing I would say is a lot of companies, unfortunately, haven't been as really blessed as some of the construction companies, that they've really had to look at making changes in their workforce. So that's the other big thing, and we can talk about that if you'd like in further detail.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. I think there's two things that really stand out for me. One is companies who are having to reduce staff, have furloughed people, have gone through PPP, all those things. And then, so what are you seeing in the marketplace? What should people be thinking about? What are maybe the good things that you see, good practices that people could use as it relates to having to make those hard decisions and changes?
Sure. Now that's good question. So one of the biggest things that I would say there, Chris, is that that a lot of companies have really struggled. I would probably say more of about 2 or 3 months ago, right when this started, that a number of companies were really deciphering whether they should look at laying people off or furloughing. And the biggest thing with furloughs is that you have the opportunity to bring people back. And and if we just wind the clock backwards, just the beginning of this year and fourth quarter of last year, it was a war for talent. So good people are still very hard to find. So I'd say one of the key things I've tried to advise clients on is really focusing, if you do have low performers, this is really, really a good time to possibly get rid of some bottom performers and bottom feeders, because every company has a bottom 10%. I don't care who you are and how long you've been in business. So that's one of the key things to do. Furloughs is a really great option too. And the other thing that I know companies have done quite often is they've also made some strategic salary cuts. So they've maintained their workforce, but they've actually done some strategic cuts. And typically the math works on those, that the more money you make, the bigger the pay cut is.
Right.
So they try to make sure that the folks who are probably at $40,000 or $50,000 base salary are the least impacted. The folks who are maybe 100,000 or 150,000 are a little bit more impacted because they could probably stand the financial hardship that would create.
Sure. That kind of leads me to the next question that I really wanted to ask you, and some of the things that that as I work with clients, it's part of what I'm dealing with, and the clients are dealing with is in this environment for companies that do have lots of employees working remotely. Maybe people are coming in contact with the virus and they have to quarantine, but they're not sick and they need to work. And what can employers do to keep that employee engagement up and keep their best, as you say, their best talented people, on board, and as they weather the storm?
Right, yeah. I think the biggest thing that managers have to do is they really have to, first and foremost, I'd say within let's say the executive ranks, is really having clear and transparent communications around exactly what's going on. What is their game plan if most of their employees were in a single building, let's say they're under one roof. I'd say the key thing is looking at, because there's a lot of reentry back into the workforce programs that are being devised now or started. So I would say making sure that employers clearly articulate to their employees what's that going to look like. And the key thing there is if they are starting to bring folks in, and maybe all of them have been remote, is really making sure that they focus on safety.
Yeah.
How are we going to keep this work environment safe? I would say the other thing, because in some cases, because the COVID cases have been on an uptick again in Texas. So if companies are looking at waiting several more months, is really focusing on staying connected with the employee base. So managers being really focused on how are they going to stay connected. And I would say the key thing is going back to your culture. Because I always say, and I know my finance friends always go back to say, cash is king, but I would debate them to say that actually culture is king. And I would really say, what got employees to come on board, to be excited about working for you is your culture. So you need to possibly be a little more creative and a little more freewheeling as to how you would actually change up your culture so you keep the dynamics of your culture and core values, even though you're having a lot of people working remotely, or making it fun. So if one of your, and I know some core companies have core values around having a fun environment, doing virtual happy hours, doing things. I know that one of the companies that I know about, they're actually having some of their employees, they actually love to do like watercoloring, and they love to do things that are very artistic. And so they're actually doing that, and they're actually putting that on a YouTube channel. So they can actually use some of the gifts and talents of their employees to actually reach out to not only other people, but also for their kids who are somewhat tied up at home.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's awesome. Do you find really in this, in the virtual kind of way, you said it, and I think it's worth kind of going back to, you got to really double down on your communication, and your
Exactly.
connectivity. It's harder.
Right, exactly.
It requires more effort, but that's a big part of being able to keep that culture vibrant and keeping people connected and communicating. And we've got to figure out how to continue to do business, right? We can't
Right.
just shut them all down. So.
No, exactly. And that's the biggest thing. I would say that the key thing to think about too is really focusing on how many, because there's the classic line of with communication, you have to communicate 7 times in 7 different ways. So that's kind of one of those fail-safe things that happens probably in sales, like 360 Consulting does, and you guys are really good at, by the way. And also, but just helping to have very different mechanisms for communication, also different forums for employees. You could have, maybe it's a Friday town hall, or having a, Friday happy hours, shutting down things at 3 o'clock. Nowadays with all the different, the online dining, different tools like Uber Eats and DoorDash, et cetera, maybe you could still do a team lunch.
Yeah.
And you have lunch delivered.
Yeah.
And then you just have a team lunch on a Friday.
Right.
And then just saying, we're going to get together for a couple of hours, guys, and just talk about what's on your mind. How's it going for you at home? one of my clients actually, they're having me facilitate a number of sessions that are very non-business related. It's almost like there's no business agenda. It's really around how are you doing? How's your family doing? Do you have any relatives who are impacted by COVID? And then really just start that with some really interesting open-ended questions, and then let those conversations go from there. Because I think if you do that, then it just shows you're not just concerned, the manager's just not concerned about what's happening. What have you done for me lately from a business perspective? They're asking much more focused on what have you done for me? How are things going from a personal perspective versus just worrying about that deadline that's coming up next week.
That's interesting. So em- should employers be thinking about, thinking about that more? Just the emotional impact of what's going on today, because, I think often, I believe I see it in clients we work with that, business owners this is a very tumultuous time, and so, they're trying to figure out how to keep cash flow, how to keep revenues, how to keep their best people, how to make it, weather the storm, how to get through this thing.
Right.
And they may be kind of skipping, hey, what's going on emotionally with some of the people in my business and some of my key players.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a great way to look at it too, Chris. I do a newsletter monthly, and one of the key things we did probably a month or two ago was around change management and around the emotional side of change. And you look at it too that for some folks, they're going to have a range of different emotions depending on what's happening, because some of them may have a number of young kids at home, some of them may have a number of teenagers at home who now have a driver's license, and they're always clamoring to go out to be with their friends. And with the little kids, though, it's just very much hands-on and much more physical. And for us personally, for instance, we have an elderly parent in the mix, and so we're also very concerned about her. So there's lots of things from an emotional perspective. I think that companies, even though a lot of times some companies are they're a little bit too sterile, and they're like, okay, we only talk to people about business. We don't want to know what happens in their personal life. That's none of our business. But I would say the companies that are really going to make it out, that are really going to weather this storm because it may become prolonged, are those companies that really connect with the people side of that person versus just the business side of that individual. And they're the ones that are really going to fare well.
That makes perfect sense. So what do you think will happen? I hate this term, but we keep hearing, the new normal. And in some ways, let's hope that we don't have to make too many changes and eventually get back to normal.
Right.
But what would be things employers should be thinking about in your mind as it relates to what the new normal might be? Long-term employees working remotely, changing office space, things of that nature. Is there anything kind of percolating up that's on your mind about that?
I think, that there's a couple of thoughts there is that, I think companies have to be thinking about really who are essential workers to have in the workforce, who need to be in an office environment.
Right.
Because I think we can argue and the type of work we do at HR Catalyst is a little more hands-on because you're trying to have that connectedness with the people. For you, perhaps with 360, you want your salespeople to be out there hunting all the time. So it could be something to where I'd say first and foremost, how do you optimize the people who actually need to be in the workforce and actually work in the office and maybe work remotely? And some of those would also work remotely very, very well. I would say the other thing too, there's a lot of psychology there too. Because some people who are extremely extroverted, even though that could be a classic thing for a salesperson, they actually need community. And so I think the other thing you can do, and other things that I would be counseling business owners on, especially as we kind of weather the storm and things start to, let's knock on wood here, to say they start picking up in third Q and fourth Q of this year, that as you maybe look at hiring, perhaps you've let go of some bottom performers and you're looking at bringing on some new staff, is really doing a very, very intentional job of hiring folks to understand clearly what kind of an environment do they work successfully in. because there's lots of ways to do that from a personality perspective to really be able to have much greater success around what type of people and almost the DNA or the personality of that individual who works very well in a remote kind of an individual environment. Whereas you have the contrary, you have people who definitely need that community feel, and making sure you try to categorize people and jobs that are going to match the individual, but also looking at from a company perspective, you really optimize which people can work well in an office environment and need to be in that, and which ones conversely need to be in kind of that remote environment, and they work really well in that kind of environment, heads down, and they work really, really well there.
Yeah, that's great. So Mark, you talked about your clients, kind of size and everything, but, what's, people who work with HR Catalyst, what are some of the things that you help companies with, and what's kind of the ideal situation where they say, hey, Mark, we need your help?
Yeah, I think it's really when one of the key things that we try to do from HR Catalyst, we really focus on the key thing I try to do anytime I meet a new CEO, business owner, et cetera, I'm going to ask them about their business challenges and what are their business challenges, the classical line of what's keeping you up at night. And if they come back with a list, let's say ask them what are the top 3 to 5 business challenges you have, and if they have at least 3, if they come up with 4 or 5, and at least 3 of those are people related, then I would say that's going to be the ideal client. So what that would look like if they have really high employee turnover, and they found that maybe in the last year or two as they've grown, they find their employee turnover has grown and grown too. And so they're finding out that especially in a lot of cases too, they may have longer term employees now who are deciding to leave.
Yeah.
So that could be a critical thing. Another thing would be if they're looking at having to have another level of management and they really don't know how to bring in a new level of management or a new level of leadership. The other key thing we can do is help them really somewhat decipher the secret sauce of how to choose and how to be very selective about leaders, and also how to be able to put together a very highly customized leadership development program for them. And the other thing would be a company possibly that's looking at growing through acquisitions. We've done a lot of work in the M&A space, so mergers and acquisitions. So another thing too we can look at is helping them really do a better job up front. Most 80% of acquisitions fail.
Yep.
And that's something, doesn't matter if you're a Fortune 500 company or a company that has 100 people. That's a statistic that's been around for years. So we can help them do a much better job in due diligence to be able to stack the deck. So a company they're looking at acquiring, they're going to have a much better likelihood because typically we're going to be looking for cultural fit.
And you said it, right? Culture is king. So.
Yeah, exactly. I did.
Well, Mark, look, man, you and I could sit here and talk all day. We have before, but I really want to thank you for coming in. Love the work that you do. Have an immense respect for you. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for being on a 360 view. And that will do it for today. So thanks for joining us on a 360 view. Mark Mitford from HR Catalyst. Let's go out and do good business.
Great. Thanks, Chris.